The man who spent 3 decades making me feel worthless just asked me to prove my worth by signing over everything I own. I'm 28 years old. I own a small apartment I bought with money I earned from a career I built in a field I chose. Last month, my father told me I was never wanted, that he spent 28 years raising a child against his will, and that I owe him my apartment as compensation for the sacrifice of tolerating my existence. This is what happened. Part 1. The absence where a father should have been. The thing about growing up with a distant father is that you don't have a clear wound to show anyone. Nobody hit me. Nobody screamed. My father never did the obvious, recognizable things that make bad fathers easy to label. He was there, physically, financially, legally. He showed up. He paid for things. He kept the lights on and food on the table. But there was an absence where presence should have been. A coolness where warmth might exist. He attended my school events and checked his watch throughout. He paid for my activities and never once asked how they went. He sat at the dinner table every night for 18 years and was mentally somewhere else entirely. I grew up across from a man whose eyes never quite focused on me, as if I were slightly to the left of where he was actually looking. I made excuses for a long time. He's just not emotional. He's from a different generation. Men like him don't express things the way mothers do. I watched other fathers in other driveways tossing footballs, roughhousing, laughing too loud at their sons' jokes, and I told myself that wasn't the only valid kind of fatherhood. My father's version was quieter, more reserved. That was all. My mother compensated. She was warm in the way that suggested she knew warmth was in short supply and was working overtime to cover the deficit. She came to every event. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered details I mentioned once and brought them up weeks later. Looking back, I understand what she was doing. She was trying to be 2 parents in a marriage to a man who had already mentally left a family he never wanted to join. I was a good student. I was determined in the way children are when they're trying to earn something they don't quite understand. Some approval, some acknowledgement, some moment where their father's eyes focus and stay focused. I got good grades. I was accepted into a competitive engineering program. I graduated with honors, landed a solid job at 23, and spent the next 3 years saving with an obsessiveness that probably looked unhealthy from the outside but felt like building a wall from the inside. At 26, I bought my apartment. $147,000. Small, 1-bedroom, south-facing windows, a kitchen I gradually learned to cook in. Mine. When I told my parents, my mother cried. Actually cried, standing in my kitchen, touching the countertops like they were sacred. My father walked through the rooms, nodded once, said, "Good," and asked if I had a newspaper. I told myself that was just him. Just how he was. I was wrong. But I didn't know that yet. Part 2. The Confession. My father is 58 now. Retirement is on the horizon, 3, maybe 4 years away, and he's been increasingly preoccupied with what that looks like. His pension is modest. His savings are present but not comfortable. He spent the last year making comments that, in retrospect, were building towards something. After everything I've given, I deserve some peace. You'd think a man my age would have some stability. I've sacrificed my whole life for this family. I didn't understand what this family meant to him. I do now. It started with a request for financial support. Not alone, he was clear about that, the way people are when they want to close the door on repayment before it opens. Ongoing help. Monthly contributions. I said I'd do what I could within my means, which were real. I have a mortgage, I have savings goals, I have a life I'm building. He pushed for more. What about the apartment? You could sell it. Combine resources. I said no. He pushed harder. I held the line. And then something in him shifted, some long-closed valve finally opened, and he said the words that reorganized everything I thought I knew about my life. You don't understand what I've sacrificed. Your mother wanted a child. I didn't. I never wanted children. But she insisted, and I stayed because that's what men do. I worked my entire life providing for a family I never planned, never wanted, never asked for. Every hour at that job, every dollar I earned, every year of my life, spent on something that was never my choice. You were never my choice. And now, when I ask for something back, you refuse? You owe me, boy. You owe me for every year I spent raising a child I never wanted. I left without responding. I drove home. I sat in my apartment, the apartment he wanted, for 4 hours without turning on a light. I just sat there while the city outside went dark and then lit up again in that different, quieter way cities do after midnight. He said, "You were never my choice." 28 years of coldness suddenly made sense. He wasn't incapable of love, He was unwilling. Every absent moment was deliberate. Every cold interaction was resentment, not limitation. I wasn't unloved because he couldn't love. I was unloved because he chose not to. Every memory recontextualized in those 4 hours. Every school event he attended with his eyes on his watch. Every conversation that ended 2 sentences before it should have. Every birthday where he handed me a card he clearly hadn't read before signing it. It wasn't stoicism. It wasn't generational emotional limitation. It was a man performing the minimum requirements of a role he despised, for 28 years, while the child he resented tried desperately to figure out what he was doing wrong. Nothing. I was doing nothing wrong. I was just there. That was the crime, apparently. Just being there. Update 1. The conversation with my mother. 3 days after the confrontation with my father, I called my mother. I needed her to tell me I'd misheard. I needed her to offer some explanation that would make the thing he said smaller, or contextual, or wrong. She couldn't. Did you know? I asked her. Did you know he never wanted me? Silence. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. He told you that? Her voice cracked on the second word and didn't recover. He said it to explain why I owe him an apartment. That he spent 28 years raising a child against his will, and now it's time for payment. More silence. Then, I thought he would come around. When you were born, I thought seeing you would change his mind. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. She'd known. For 28 years, she had known that her husband resented the child she'd wanted, and she had managed that information alone, quietly, while arranging her whole life around the hope that it might eventually resolve itself. She had compensated so hard. All that warmth, all those follow-up questions, all that deliberate presence, because she knew what I was not getting from the other side and was trying to cover it with her own. Her hope cost me a childhood. His resentment cost me a father. And now they both, in different ways, wanted my apartment. I don't say that to be cruel about my mother. I understand what she did and why she did it. I also understand that I spent 28 years wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't make my father's eyes focus, why I wasn't enough, and the answer was that someone who knew me knew and said nothing. That's a secondary wound, and it's complicated, and I'm still working through it. But I needed her to hear it said plainly. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. It was real, she confirmed, quietly, from somewhere inside the 3 decades she'd spent hoping. Update 2. My uncle, and what context does and doesn't do. A week later, I called my uncle, my father's older brother. They're close, or as close as my father gets to people. I wanted context. I wanted to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. My uncle is a blunt man, and I appreciated that about him. He never wanted kids, he told me. He told me that before he married your mother. She wanted a family. He went along with it because he thought that's what you did. By the time you were born, he felt like it was already too late to say he'd made a mistake. So he stayed and worked and called it sacrifice and never dealt with the fact that he made his own choices. He paused, then added, "It's not about you specifically. You could have been any child. He didn't want fatherhood. That's what he didn't want." I think he meant that to be comforting. It wasn't. Uncle said, "It's not about you specifically. He didn't want fatherhood." That was supposed to comfort me. It didn't. I spent 28 years feeling specifically unwanted, and it turns out I was generically unwanted. Still unwanted. Just impersonally. There's a particular loneliness in that. The dream of, if only he knew me better, collapses when you understand the rejection was never about you. It was about the category you occupied. I was a placeholder for an unwanted concept, and nothing I could have done, no version of myself I could have assembled, would have changed that. The target was always going to be hit, whoever stood in the spot called my child. I thanked my uncle and hung up and sat with that for several days. Update 3. Returning to my father, and what gets examined in the light. I requested a meeting with my father 2 weeks after the original confrontation. I needed to respond, and I needed to do it clearly, without the shock that had silenced me the first time. We met at his house. My mother made coffee and then quietly left the room, which was its own kind of answer. I had prepared what I wanted to say. I had written notes, actually, because I'm an engineer and I think in structures, and this was a structure I needed to build correctly. "You said I owe you," I started. "That you raised me against your will, and that obligates me. I want to examine that logic." He sat across from me with an expression I recognized, the one where he is present physically and somewhere else entirely. "Nobody held a gun to your head," I said. "You could have left. Men leave marriages all the time. You could have paid child support and lived your own life, A life you actually chose. You stayed. You made that choice, and you kept making it, every morning for 28 years. Nobody forced that on you. Your own decisions kept you in a situation you resented. You don't understand what it meant to be trapped, he said. Your mother would have been devastated. Society expected me to stay. I did what was expected and gave up everything. And this is my reward. You gave up connection by choice, I said. Every day you woke up and chose resentment over engagement. You could have tried. You could have tried to love me, or at least tried to find something in fatherhood worth having. You chose not to. That's not sacrifice, that's voluntary suffering you inflicted on yourself. And on me. Something moved across his face that I couldn't quite name. He's not an unintelligent man, my father. He knows when an argument lands, even when he refuses to acknowledge it. I provided, he said, finally. You provided, I agreed. You kept me alive and educated. That's the legal minimum of fatherhood, and you met it. But you're not asking me to thank you for the legal minimum. You're asking me to give you my apartment. Those aren't the same category. He returned to the concrete. My pension isn't enough. Your apartment could set me up for retirement. Sell it, give me the money, and we're even. You got 28 years of support. I'm asking for 10, maybe 15 years of support in return. That's fair math. He said I got 28 years of support. I got 28 years of cold meals and colder silence. I got wondering every day what I did wrong, why my father didn't love me. That's not support, that's damage. And now he wants the apartment as payment for the damage he did while he was busy resenting me. That's not what I got, I told him. What I got was wondering, every single day of my childhood, what was wrong with me. Why my father's eyes never focused on me properly. Why I wasn't enough. I built my whole sense of self around that question. All that work, all that ambition, all that saving, because connection wasn't available and achievement was the only language I knew how to speak. You gave me that. And now you want my apartment as payment for the damage you did while resenting that I existed. He had no answer to that. Not because he disagreed, I think. Because he recognized it. Update 4. The therapy room, and what gets named there. I started seeing a therapist shortly after the second conversation with my father. I want to be honest about this because I think people sometimes present therapy as a revelation machine. You go in, you cry twice, you emerge healed. It's not like that. It's slow and uncomfortable, and occasionally you leave a session feeling worse than when you arrived because something that was buried is now just exposed. But it gave me language. My therapist is direct in a way I appreciate. In our third session, after I'd explained the situation in full, she said something that restructured how I was seeing it. Your father has spent 28 years feeling victimized by his own choices, she said. He created a story in which he is the tragic figure, the man who sacrificed everything for a family he didn't want. But the story only works if you ignore that he chose, repeatedly, to stay. He chose resentment over engagement. He chose silence over honesty. He chose to make himself a martyr for decisions he made himself. And when you're the martyr in your own story, someone has to be the cause of your suffering. He cast you in that role before you were born. My therapist said his suffering was self-inflicted. He chose resentment over engagement every single day. He made himself a victim of his own choices and then sent me the bill. 28 years of his voluntary misery, priced at one apartment. That's not math, that's extortion. She also said something I've thought about more than almost anything else in this process. He is, in his own way, a tragic figure. Not a villain, a man who was honest with himself too late, who made choices from fear of social expectation rather than genuine desire, who then couldn't face the gap between the life he had and the life he might have preferred. His suffering is real. It's just not your responsibility. That distinction matters. I don't enjoy the thought of my father as a suffering man. I don't find satisfaction in his unhappiness. But suffering, even real suffering, does not create debt in the person who was harmed by the choices that produced the suffering. He was unhappy with his life. That unhappiness was aimed at me for 28 years. Both things can be true. His pain was real, and I don't owe him an apartment for it. My therapist also helped me see what I'd done with my father's silence over the years. I'd internalized it. Made it about my worth, my adequacy, my lovability. The child's brain does this, assumes the parent's emotional state is a reflection of the child's value. I built an identity around being the kind of person who works harder, saves more, achieves further, because that was the only way I knew to try to earn a focus that was never actually available. That's the work I'm doing now. Untangling what I built to earn his attention from what I actually want. The apartment is part of that. It was the first thing I ever bought purely for myself, not as a display of achievement, not as proof of adequacy, just as a place to exist on my own terms. He will not have it. Update 5. The ultimatum, and what ends. My father issued an ultimatum. I expected something like it. If you won't help me, I have no son. You're exactly what I always knew you were. An obligation that took everything and gave nothing back. I'll tell everyone what kind of son you are. Everyone will know you abandoned your father when he needed you. He gave me an ultimatum, help or I have no son. But he never had a son. He had an obligation he resented. I'm not losing a father, I'm just stopping pretending I had one. The relationship didn't end. It just finally matched reality. I told him, you just told me I was an obligation. Not a son, an obligation. Fine. I'm an obligation that's done. Tell whoever you want whatever you want. Tell them I refuse to pay for my own unwanted existence. Anyone who thinks I owe you my apartment for surviving your resentment can volunteer their own. He followed through on the threat. He called relatives, aunts, cousins, people I see at holidays and occasional dinners, and told them I was abandoning him. That I refused to help my aging father. Some believed the version he presented. A few called me to ask if I was really going to let him struggle. I told them, plainly, what he had said to me. Some went quiet. Some understood. One aunt told me she'd known for years that something was off in our family and she was sorry I'd spent my childhood in it. My mother is caught in the middle, as she has always been caught in the middle. She calls me carefully. She doesn't defend what my father said, but she also can't fully condemn the man she married. Her position is understandable and impossible, and I'm trying to maintain a relationship with her without requiring her to choose sides in a war she didn't start. That's its own ongoing work. My father and I haven't spoken in 8 months. He's apparently found other resources for retirement. There were apparently some assets my mother hadn't been fully aware of. So the demand for my apartment was either a test or a gamble. Either way, the financial emergency may not have been as urgent as it was presented. That information arrived via my mother and landed with a specific kind of weight. The realization that a man who had just confessed to resenting me for my entire existence may have also been leveraging that confession toward a financial goal that wasn't even as necessary as he claimed. I don't have a clean story to tell about that. Just the fact of it. Resolution. The apartment. 8 months later. I'm writing this from my apartment. South-facing windows. A kitchen I've gotten genuinely good in. A bookshelf I built by hand from a kit on a Sunday afternoon 6 months ago, because I had the afternoon and nothing was telling me how to use it. There's a photograph of my mother on the shelf. We talk regularly, still, carefully, with a new awareness of the complicated thing between us, but we talk. I'm not ready to let that relationship dissolve, even though it's not uncomplicated. She made choices I have to sit with, and so did I, and we're figuring out what an honest version of this relationship looks like going forward. There is no photograph of my father. I realized this recently. My therapist asked if I'd taken anything down when our estrangement became formal, and I realized I hadn't. Because there was never anything to take down. Somewhere in me, some level below what I was consciously willing to admit, I had known. Not the specific truth of it, not the words, you were never my choice, but something. Some awareness that the relationship was a performance of a thing rather than the thing itself. The apartment is quiet and fully mine. I want to be careful here not to make this into a triumph narrative, because it isn't, not entirely. My father is a 58-year-old man who made decisions out of fear and social expectation and then spent 3 decades in a life he resented, and there is something genuinely sad about that. He wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a person who was too afraid to make honest choices, to leave a marriage he didn't want, to be honest about what he could and couldn't give, to have the harder conversations before they metastasized into this. He trapped himself and then looked for someone to blame, and I was the person most available for that role. That's tragic, in the proper sense of the word. A man undone by his own choices, unable to see clearly enough to understand that the person he was billing was the person he'd already spent decades collecting from. He wanted compensation for a child he didn't want. What he got was the natural consequence of having spent 28 years building nothing. Nothing. Not love. He never cultivated it. Not gratitude. He never invested in the relationship that might have produced it. Not an apartment. He never deserved someone else's survival proof. Final reflection. He wants compensation for raising a child he didn't want. But nobody forced him to stay. He could have left, paid child support, lived his own life. He chose to stay and resent. His choice. Not my debt. I don't owe rent for existing in a house someone chose not to leave. I've thought a lot about what I would say to him if I were the kind of person who wrote letters, or if the kind of conversation where this could actually be said were possible. I've drafted it in my head, usually around 2 a.m. when the apartment is very quiet. You told me I was never your choice. That you raised me against your will, worked for me against your choice, spent 28 years on a family you never asked for. Then you asked for my apartment as compensation. Payment for the sacrifice of tolerating my existence. But here is what you don't understand. I didn't ask to be born. I didn't ask you to stay. I didn't ask for your resentment or your coldness or your 28 years of bare minimum fatherhood performed through gritted teeth. You chose all of that. Every day you woke up and chose to remain and resent instead of leaving and being honest. Your choices. Your suffering. Your responsibility. Not mine. I don't owe you for the childhood you made cold. I don't owe you for the father you refused to be. I don't owe you the apartment I earned or the life I built or the future I'm building without your approval or your presence. You wanted compensation for raising a child you didn't want. You got exactly what you always had, nothing from me. Not love, you never cultivated it. Not gratitude, you never earned it. Not an apartment, you never deserved it. Just the truth you already knew, I was never yours. And now, finally, I'm okay with that. Because I'm mine. The apartment is mine. The life is mine. The future is mine. You don't owe your existence to someone who resented it. You just owe yourself the life they couldn't take. That's where I am, 8 months out. Still in therapy. Still processing. Still figuring out what it means to build self-worth on a foundation that isn't someone else's wanting. It turns out you can do it. It's slow, and some days the weight of the specific thing he said comes back fresh and lands like it did the first time. But you can do it. I'm doing it. The apartment is quiet. The windows face south. I'm here. That's enough.